Hello and welcome to A Theory of Everything. I'm Luis Razo, the director of ASEM and host of this channel. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Professor Roger Crisp, a Uehiro Fellow and tutor in moral philosophy at St. Anne's College at Oxford. I haven't devoted a lot of time to moral philosophy on this channel in the past, but I did release a brief video on the physical foundations of morality, in which I make a historically unprecedented, and I'd like to think compelling argument to explain how and why moral philosophy necessarily sits at the heart of everything that matters to humans, both individually and as a species. Professor Crisp has dedicated his career to these moral and philosophical questions and has published a number of books, one of which is a translation of Aristotle's Nichomachean Ethics, arguably the most influential book on moral philosophy ever written, and another book called Sacrifice Regained, about self-interest and morality in the British tradition. Ideas matter, of course, so the disproportionate impact that these Anglo ideas have had on the modern world is something that we should all consider deeply. Pay special attention to the various references that Professor Crisp makes to the unresolved tension between the individual good and the common good. I'm not the only one who understands that this is the central tension on which the survival of humanity is likely to depend. We didn't get to talk as long as I would have liked, so I hope to have the professor back at some point to delve deeper into his important ideas on self-sacrifice and morality. As always, you'll find a timestamp in the video description. Thanks for your time. Professor Crisp, thank you so much for your time today. It's a real privilege to have you.
Thanks very much, Louis. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you, of course, are a professional moral philosopher at one of the most respected universities in the world. So for the sake of our listeners, I'd like to start by framing our discussion against a big picture historical background to philosophy, which in the Western tradition, of course, goes back to the Greeks. Moral philosophy in particular goes back to Aristotle's Nichomachean Ethics, which you've had the intellectual and academic wherewithal to translate. In fact, your translation has been praised by your peers, as have your numerous books, including two that are of particular interest to us today, one called Reason and the Good, which you published, I think, in 2006, and more recently, Sacrifice Regained, which is about morality and self-sacrifice in British moral philosophy. This is fascinating because on the one hand, your work goes back to the beginning of systematic moral philosophy with your translation of Aristotle. Then we cross more than 2,000 years to arrive in a very real sense to the cutting edge of your field with your career at Oxford. I don't want the significance of this to be lost on either myself or our listeners. So if it's okay with you, can we begin with a couple of basic questions? What
Sure.
is ethics, Professor?
I suppose ethics is that set of norms and values in any society, group, culture, which are used by the individuals in that culture to guide the way they act primarily, but also the way they live as a whole. And of course, each person will have their own view of what those norms should be. So that we can generalize about the ethics of particular groups, there will nearly always be disagreements within them. Usually, if you ask somebody about their ethical beliefs, they'll have arguments for them. And I see philosophical ethics as really seamlessly developing out of the arguments that non-philosophers have for their ethical views, though obviously philosophers take them further to become much more abstract and universal than most people's ethics might be.
Okay, and what is metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics?
Okay, well, ethics is, I guess, what I just said. That's these beliefs and propositions about how we should act and live. Metaethics is about those beliefs, that practice of living ethically, and involves questions about, for example, whether the propositions that people hold to in their ordinary life can be true or false. So some people think that moral judgments cannot be true or false. In the past, it's been thought that they are really just expressions of emotion. Many people that hold that they're somehow tied up with our sentiments or our desires in such a way that they are not apt for truth or indeed falsity, whereas so-called realists in philosophy believe that they are, so they can be true or false. Metaethics also covers the metaphysics of moral properties. So I guess most people would agree that a property like the length of some object is fairly objective. So if I've got something that's 3 meters long, it's 3 meters long. That's a fact. Whereas if we claim that some action is right or wrong, that seems slightly more mysterious because, for example, we can't detect such properties using standard scientific methods. So for this reason, some people think there are no such properties. We kind of make them up, or we project them onto the world, or we invent them. They're sort of fictions, whereas again, realists will believe that they're out there. So that's metaethics. And then I think applied ethics or practical ethics is, as I understand it, it's really the application of more general ethical principles to particular problems. For example, problems about life and death, or population levels, or business.
I see. Okay, and where do you situate your own work within the history of philosophy in general and British philosophy in particular?
My work on the whole is a footnote to the work of Henry Sidgwick, who was a British philosopher in Cambridge. He died at the very end of the 19th century and wrote a book called The Methods of Ethics, which several philosophers have said they believe to be the greatest book in moral philosophy ever written, and I agree with that. I think it is a great book, but I also think Sidgwick was right about many things.
That's very interesting. Can I ask you to compare Sidgwick with Aristotle?
Yeah, you can. I mean, I'm not claiming that Sidgwick was a better philosopher than Aristotle.
Okay.
Get that,
okay.
Get that clear. I mean, he was standing on Aristotle's shoulders, and in fact, he was trying to do certain things that Aristotle did. I mean, one thing Sidgwick did was try to tidy up the morality of his own day to make it as plausible as possible. And in fact, I think his discussion in part 3 of the Methods of Ethics is the best expression of what you might call deontological morality that there's ever been. I think the 2 main differences would be that Sidgwick is a hedonist, so he thinks the only good there is pleasure, whereas on my interpretation of Aristotle, I think he's committed to the view that there is only one true pleasure, which is the pleasure from acting virtuously. And it's not good because it's pleasant. So acting virtuously is good just because of other properties it has. For example, it's being noble. So he's a long way from Sidgwick on that. But also Sidgwick was essentially a utilitarian. That is somebody who believed that what we should do is produce the best outcome, the greatest amount of well-being or welfare. Whereas Aristotle certainly didn't think that. I mean, he believed that there were many duties that we have, and we have to decide which one to act on in particular cases. I mean, just to make it clear, Sidgwick does sometimes call himself a utilitarian. He was often described as a utilitarian, but actually his book ends on a note of despair because he can't decide which is correct. Philosophical egoism, which is the view that you should promote your own good, or utilitarianism, which is that you should promote the overall good.
Well, that's an interesting point. It might be a good way to ask the next question, which is, where would Aristotle or Sidgwick fall on the question of the overall goal of humanity in terms of survival? It seems that survival should be an absolute priority. Would Sidgwick agree on this? Can you comment?
Yeah, I think Sidgwick's answer would be, other things being equal, we should go on as long as possible and make sure that the sum of utility or welfare or well-being in the history of humanity, or the history of humanity and post-humanity, and of course he would have included all non-human sentient life in his calculations, is as great as possible. And Aristotle, I think, just didn't think quite like that. I mean, I don't think he really thought about the long-term future in the way that Sidgwick did, and certainly would have done now. I think Aristotle would have believed that what human beings should do is continue to live virtuously in communities which are appropriate for that. And my guess is that he would have thought we've gone way beyond appropriateness in our communities. They're far too big. And our education is defective in so many ways. Then there's one interesting question, is what would Aristotle say to us now? And Alistair MacIntyre in the last century essentially suggests that Aristotle would say, well, you need to go back in time and start living much more locally and follow local practices and customs rather than the kind of abstract, universal liberal principles that most of us in the West try to live by today.
Interesting. So would you say that Aristotle is still relevant, less relevant, more relevant than ever? What would you say?
I think he's as relevant as he always was, and that is highly relevant. I mean, it's one of great books.
But then I see or I sense a tension between Aristotle being relevant and being able to go back to living locally. How do we balance that or resolve that tension?
Well, I guess if you look back at the history of philosophy, it's I mean, apart from me and Sidgwick, it's very rarely the case that one reads a philosopher and believes that they've got things mostly right. Aristotle clearly got a lot of things, well, not clearly, I would say got a lot of things very wrong. So I do think that belief about the significance of virtue is exaggerated. And obviously I believe that his views about natural slavery and the status of women and non-Greeks were wrong. But there's so much else in his philosophy which is worth considering.
Interesting. I'm struck by the unresolved question in Sidgwick's career about the place of self-interest versus utilitarianism. Can you comment a little more about this and what you think what might be a possible solution to this? Because at heart, it seems to me that we're dealing with a very critical question: is how do we balance self-interest with survival, or self-interest or personal interest with collective interests? Can you comment on this?
Yes, Sidgwick said that was the profoundest problem in ethics, and I'm inclined to agree with him. Yeah, I mean, it's my view of how he arrived at that pessimistic conclusion is as follows. So his epistemology, his theory of knowledge, was intuitionist. So he believed that the way to make progress in ethics is to consider certain propositions as impartially as possible, to make them as clear to yourself as possible and as precise, and ask yourself whether they seem to you self-evident. Now, by that, he didn't mean, do they seem to you absolutely 100% certain, right? You've always got to, Sidgwick is a fallibilist. You've got to accept you could be wrong. But there are certain propositions he believed that are and should be seen as self-evident by people who consider them properly. So to give you an analogy, if I say to you X equals X, and you think about that proposition, it's very likely you will think that is self-evident.
Sure.
It could be no other way. Or even perhaps 5 plus 7 equals 12. You might think that couldn't be any other way. So Sidgwick considered the proposition that what I should do is maximally promote my own good. So that would be egoism. And he found that self-evident.
Well, this is interesting. I'm sorry if I can pause just momentarily, and I'll let you continue. Because I was thinking as I listened to you, something self-evident as X equals X is, I think, fairly universal. But when you get to the question of egoism being really important, obviously that's much less universal. So what do we do about this?
Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, in the history of philosophy, it hasn't been universal, but it has been the dominant position, actually. It was until the 19th century when it started to disappear, and it had certainly from Western philosophy it has virtually disappeared. Maybe it'll come back. But I take your point, and I think that the corner that Sidgwick painted himself into is a result of not seeing that proposition can be read as it can be read with or without an other things equal clause, right? So if we said to most people, other things equal, should you promote your own self-interest as much as possible? Then I suspect many people would say yes, because other things equal could include all sorts of other principles.
I suppose it depends on what you mean by other things equal, I suppose, no?
Yeah, exactly. But so the other principle that Sidgwick persuaded himself of was that from the point of view of the universe, as he put it, my own good is of no more importance than anybody else's, so I should promote the good of all impartially. And obviously these come into conflict. But if you put other things equal clauses in front of each of them, they're each giving you a different reason. And conflicts between reasons are absolutely standard in our lives. We face them all the time. And we don't see any great difficulty with the notion that reasons can conflict. So I think what Sidgwick should have done is see these two principles as capturing two different reasons, which then have to be balanced one against the other. So the question is the one that you mentioned, the profound problem of how should I deal with the conflict between my own good and the good of all.
Yes, I can't help but be struck by the obvious conflict between the idea that I have to look out for my own good versus the Christian concept of self-sacrifice. And of course, the Christian concept is a couple thousand years old. And I don't know if he even considered this or how he reconciled this or what he proposed. Did he propose to ignore that? Did he propose to say that was an error, or can you comment?
No, I mean, that question is absolutely spot on. Sidgwick was brought up as a Christian. I think he wanted to believe in God. And I think in some ways he did, in some senses of belief. But when it came to philosophy, he tried very hard to come up with arguments for the existence of God. And also outside his philosophy, he became very interested in psychical research. So he attended various seances and so on, because he hoped that he could get evidence of life after death, which might then be evidence for the existence of God. But anyway, he couldn't find empirical evidence. He couldn't find a plausible argument which would have closed the gap between self-sacrifice and one's own good. In other words, that one by doing the right thing, one would be doing what was best for oneself because one would be rewarded in heaven. He couldn't believe in that.
It seems that these ideas, these concepts are inextricably connected to politics, right? Because if we're talking about the common good or the collective good, you inevitably arrive to how you make decisions. So can you connect your work or the work of Aristotle or Sidgwick to political philosophy, political ideas in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both those philosophers saw ethics as the foundation of politics. So Aristotle's book, the Nichomachean Ethics, which, as you mentioned, is his most well-known work in ethics, mentions politics early on. And the book consists of lectures that were given in Athens to aristocratic young men from all over Greece, many of whom would be going back to their cities to engage in politics. So I think he wants to hook them in at the beginning of the course on ethics by mentioning politics. And then at the end of the ethics, in which he's argued that human happiness consists in exercising the virtues, he introduces the politics. So his lectures on the politics follow straight on. So for him, the purpose of politics is to create the conditions for virtue in a city. Sidgwick would have taken his utilitarianism and applied it straightforwardly to politics in the way that previous utilitarians had, Bentham, Mill, and others. So the duty of a politician would be the same as the duty of a non-politician. It would be to promote the greatest good, not the good of any particular individual or set of individuals.
I see. And how do you apply these ideas to very practical problems, for example, like Brexit?
Well, there are difficulties of calculation, of course. But you're quite right. I mean, that would have been a very sensible way to think about Brexit, just to think about the good and bad consequences of Brexit, rather than to believe that there are certain principles of national sovereignty which really matter independently of the well-being of the people who live in the UK and the people in Europe. Yeah, myself, I think, as perhaps both Aristotle and Sidgwick believe in a sense. I believe that what matters in politics is the good of individual citizens.
Just out of curiosity, were you asked about this frequently during the Brexit process?
No, that's partly because certainly in the UK, philosophers are not very often asked for their opinions on matters of politics.
Very interesting. Okay. Okay. Regarding Aristotle, can you explain if there is any connection between his ethics and his four causes?
Yeah, there is a very tight connection. So this is another way in which Aristotle differs from Sidgwick. Sidgwick was really a moral philosopher, primarily. I mean, he had a worldview, but it was not especially fully worked out, whereas Aristotle had a view on just about everything, and everything fitted together. So his ethics is very closely related to his metaphysics and his biology. And so for him, to understand the way we should live our lives, we have to understand what we are. And that requires understanding the world that we live in. And essentially, he believed that there were several levels of explanation. These are the four causes you mentioned. So, for example, one fundamental one would be the material level of explanation, which we see as particularly important. So matter behaves in certain ways, and you can explain many things that happen through the natural laws that govern matter. Some will believe you can explain everything in that way, but I suppose most people don't believe that. He also believed that there were final causes. So in a nutshell, that means that the world is such that it's not really designed, that wouldn't be quite the right word, but it's such that there are purposes in it. There are goals that can be used to explain why things behave in the way that they do, and also to provide an account of why they should behave in certain ways. So we are, according to Aristotle, we are essentially rational beings. And so our purpose is to live rationally, and that is to live in accordance with virtue, according to him. And that's not something that, it's not a purpose that the gods have made up for us or anything like that. That's just it's just the way things are. And so if we can understand who we are and what we are, then we can understand how we should live.
Okay, so the goal in that case would be a virtuous life or happiness, right? For Aristotle.
Yeah, and those things are the same for him. So a virtuous life just is happiness. I believe there's nothing more than that. And actually, unhappiness is living a vicious life or an immoral life. So for him, if you're vicious, the sensible thing to do would be to commit suicide if you can't reform. Because every day you go on doing vicious things, you're making your life worse for you.
I see. And how does this compare, or at what point did Aristotelian causality fall out of favor? And does that have a relationship with how moral philosophy developed in the UK?
That's a very good question. I mean, Aristotelian science lasted a very long time. I mean, 2 millennia essentially. And Dante described Aristotle as the master of those who know. So essentially, for hundreds of years, if you wanted to understand something about the natural world or any matter really, you could go and look it up in Aristotle. I mean, clearly there was some progress made, some changes were made, but Aristotle was always at the center of it. And then essentially what happened was the scientific revolution. with the invention of modern science and its techniques and its instruments and so on. And people realized that actually they could do without final causation. And they could understand a lot of the world just in terms of standard natural law. So Aristotelian science gradually disappeared. It was gradual, it wasn't sudden. So, for example, if you take the work of William Harvey on the circulation of blood, people would say that's a paradigm example of a book published during the scientific revolution. Well, it has more references to Aristotle than to anybody else. But the science was sidelined. And then the question is, well, what happened to the ethics? I think it wasn't sidelined. I think people realized that you could gain a lot from the ethics without committing yourself to the scientific underpinning. And that's still the case.
Well, very interesting. Well, my normal listeners will be familiar with the idea, because I've taken it up quite a bit on the channel, that some of the latest advances in theoretical physics seem to suggest that Aristotle's notion of final causality has been prematurely laid to rest. In particular, the work of Uehiro Centre and his team suggests that the present, the material matter, subatomic particles, can be better explained by taking into consideration not only causes that come from the past, but causes that come from the future. So that's just an interesting side note on this, that I don't think the jury is completely out yet on the nature of the material world and the nature of reality. So I think Aristotle's final causation, final causes, apart from its impact on ethics and philosophy in general, I think ultimately has very relevant things to say about, how ultimately we're going to reconcile individualism and collectivism, because our end goal, if our end goal is to survive as a species, then these two must be reconciled, and that is ultimately is a goal. It's a goal that we can or should have to survive. So it's, in my opinion, the conception that scientifically Aristotle is completely irrelevant, I think is premature still. We still have yet a lot to learn in science. So
yeah, I think you're right. And you're also touching there on what some people call the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God, which is taken seriously by many cosmologists, as you know. And it would just be, straightforward induction tells us it would be a huge mistake to think we're close to the end of the scientific story.
Absolutely.
They're very likely to be another paradigm shift. And as you say, we may shift back to something that's much more like Aristotle.
Sure. I think in addition to the fine-tuning argument, there's the Uehiro's argument is significantly different. Is in the sense, it's more aligned with Aristotle's conception of, okay, what is the nature of reality? Aristotle felt that reality is explained by 4 different types of causes. So what Uehiro demonstrates, and he actually demonstrates it with empirical evidence, that to suggest that the present is explained better if we take all of time together as explanatory to explain the present. So it's quite fascinating, quite interesting. But in addition to that, there's a significant amount of work being done on symmetry at the cutting edge of string theory, the symmetry that exists between how information is processed in the material world and how information is processed in the human brain. So these symmetries suggest that this revolution that you've hinted at is not too far away. It's, at least we're getting inklings that maybe throwing out Aristotle, 400 years ago or whatever, was premature. So it's very fascinating stuff.
Yeah, you mentioned time there, and we do not understand time. Aristotle thought very hard about it and uncovers various problems or potential paradoxes with time, which are still highly relevant.
Well, Aristotle, if I remember right, talked about time as the measure of now I forget the term he used, but very, very fascinating stuff. I agree. And time continues to be a mystery. Now the growing consensus in theoretical physics, which is, you know, the product of 400 years of very rigorous scientific process, that time itself and space emerge from something more fundamental. So if that is the case and it emerges from something more fundamental, then it stands to reason, or it's not conceptually contradictory to say that whatever this more fundamental thing is that causes time, it comes from the past and the future. So, and in any case, I'm kind of digressing here. I'd like to come back to our discussion on your work. And what do you mean to say when you teach, or when you say that there are ultimately no moral reasons?
Okay, well, one thing I don't mean is that there are no reasons at all. It's just that the ultimate reasons we have are not moral ones. And by that, I mean that morality is something that has emerged through our culture. It's a system, I think, of social coercion, and it's very useful. So we don't really know where it came from, but presumably it emerged during the hunter-gatherer period, when when certain groups would have developed norms, and they would have praised or rewarded people who adhered to those norms and punished or blamed people who didn't. And this promoted the survival of the group. So there's a simple evolutionary story to be told about the development of morality. And there are reasons to participate in that practice in many circumstances, but they're not ultimate reasons. So morality as a system of social coercion is justified purely through its promotion of the good of individuals. And that's where our ultimate reasons lie. Our ultimate reasons lie in the promotion of the good of ourselves and other individuals, whether human or non-human.
I see. Am I correct to say, to feel that we can't escape that tension between our individual good and the good of humanity, for example? Or do you think that there is no such thing as an ultimate moral reason to believe that humanity should survive?
I think that there is that tension, and we can't escape it. But I also believe that in any particular case, when the tension arises, unless there's an absolute balance of strength of reason on each side, you will have a reason to favor your own good or to sacrifice your own good.
Okay, you take this up in Reasons and the Good, correct?
That's right.
Can you comment about the release of that book, because it's now been 14 years? Can you comment about the release of the book? Has your thinking changed? Has it been more solidified? How has the experience been since publishing this book?
I don't think my view has changed very much. I mean, I wrote that book really because Jonathan Dantzi, another British moral philosopher, said to me that nobody knew what I really thought. So I used to be in a discussion group with Jonathan and various other people, And Jonathan has a very well worked out moral theory, which everybody knows about, but I didn't have one. And when he said that, I realized that I didn't know what I really thought. So the book was my attempt to work out what I really thought about some central issues in moral philosophy, including the nature of the good, how we know about that and about our reasons for action, the objectivity of ethics, whether equality matters, various issues. And what I found was that Sidgwick had got there before me on pretty well every issue. So that's why I describe myself as, in the history of philosophy, as a footnote to Sidgwick.
Okay, and what is the connection between reason and the good and sacrifice regained?
Well, there is again a connection with Sidgwick. So Sidgwick was a very good historian of ethics. And in fact, he wrote an encyclopedia article, which turned into a little book called The Outlines of Ethics, which I'd recommend to you. And I've talked to you about this dualism that develops in Sidgwick between egoism and morality, or egoism and utilitarianism in his case. And he told a certain story about the history of that dualism as coming, for example, from the work of Joseph Butler in the British tradition. And because I agree with him that this question about the relationship between self-interest and morality is the profoundest problem, I thought it would be interesting to go back to the earlier parts of the British moral philosophical tradition from which Sidgwick emerged, to see whether he was right about the origins of his view. And rather predictably, I came to the view that he was partly right and partly wrong. I think that kind of dualism is present from an earlier time than he recognized. But I started with Hobbes, which is, that's kind of standard. I think many people would start a history of British moral philosophy with Hobbes, because Hobbes was, he stated a very clear form of philosophical egoism. He stated it so clearly and powerfully that for centuries afterwards, a lot of moral philosophy was a response to Hobbes, and hardly anybody believed him. But all these people could see the power of egoism and saw it as their job to show what was wrong with it, essentially.
What about the connection between self-interest and excuse me, and economics in the work, for example, of Adam Smith? Can you comment on this? In particular, I'm thinking of Adam Smith's conception of the invisible hand. Is there a connection?
There is. And I think one way to approach it is to make a distinction between the truth about our ethical principles on the one hand, and how we should make our decisions on the other. Because you might think that if you've got hold of the correct ethical principles, then what you should do is try and put them into practice in your life. But that doesn't follow, because it depends what the principles say. So if you take a principle like utilitarianism, which says the right thing to do is to promote the good maximally, it could be that the best way to promote good maximally is not to try to do it, but to do something else instead. So this really is what lies behind the utilitarian version of Smith's view on economics. So he's not saying, and many people who hold that view are not saying egoism is correct. To hell with other people, all that matters is yourself. They may well be saying everybody's good matters, but given the creatures we are, given that we are highly motivated to promote our own good as opposed to the good of others, we should harness that power and allow people to do that in a market economy, and it will benefit everybody. And that's been that remains a pretty standard argument in politics, which has been shown to be somewhat flawed. One needs some other principles to make it work.
Yeah, that was my next question. How do we reconcile this concept that if everybody looks out for their own good, including politicians and people in business, then we have things like a less than optimal response to pandemics, or crises in the environment, etc. So how would you suggest, or how can we possibly come to terms with these conflicts?
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple of things on that. One is that there's a difference between self-interest and self-love, as Joseph Butler put it. So many people say, oh, there's too much self-interest in the world, and Butler would agree with that, but he'd say there's not enough self-love, so you've got to get it right. And you can see that if you look at the lives of most politicians. They don't seem to me particularly enviable. They seem to me often rather unhappy people. The happier ones seem to be the ones who are not out to pursue power and money for its own sake, and are trying to help others. So self-love is better than self-interest. But also we have to remember that the markets themselves will not work among people who are motivated purely by their self-interest. They will work only on the basis of trust and some degree of honesty. So morality has to enter alongside the market.
Good points. But I suppose the big question is how exactly? Because now the current thinking is that democracy is the only solution, or the best solution, but democracy seems flawed. So how do we reconcile these things?
Well, I think there are at least two ways one could do that. The most significant one would be through moral education. So you might try to set up a market which would produce the best outcome purely through the basis of coercion, through punishments and so on, but that probably won't work because it's so easy for people to cheat. So markets are going to work much more efficiently when the actors within them have some kind of moral integrity. And that, is for people within markets, it's much better to be in a market where everybody has some degree of moral integrity than to be in a market in which nobody does. Everybody will do worse.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, this brings me to the next question. You write and think about how we deal with moral disagreement. So I suppose it's connected to this. How would you suggest we deal with moral disagreement?
Well, I mean, calmly and patiently, obviously, but there's a kind of, as you say, there's a kind of epistemological problem here, which I feel that philosophers and everybody really hasn't properly faced up to. And it's the problem of disagreement with what philosophers call epistemic peers. Okay, so if, say, you and I have a disagreement about what the weather is like in Oxford at the moment, I won't take your view very, very seriously. I mean, unless you got evidence I don't know about. I can look outside and I can see the sun is shining. You tell me it's not going to worry me. If we're having an ethical debate and you disagree with me, I've really got no reason to think that I've got better evidence than you, or I've got the capacity for greater insight into ethical truth than you. So it seems to me the rational response to that is for me to suspend judgment. So let's say I advocate utilitarianism and you advocate Aristotelianism or something, and I see you as an epistemic peer, then I believe that I should suspend judgment. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to give up discussing the issue, because I can still say to you, look, it seems to me as if utilitarianism is right, and here are some arguments for it. You can say, it seems to me that Aristotelianism is right, and here are some arguments for that. So we can continue. But I think the style of our debate would be different. We'd be a lot more respectful and less dogmatic than many people are in discussions. I also think this has implications for the methodology of modern philosophy. So the methodology of modern philosophy is individualistic. So everybody goes into their studies and comes up with their own view. They have some discussions with other people, but it is individualistic. And when people get together to discuss, they tend to get together with people that they in general agree with. So the utilitarians will meet with other utilitarians. The Aristotelians will meet with other Aristotelians. And this seems to me quite the wrong approach, really. What I think it's a good idea for people to work in groups, as in science. There are many sciences in which research groups are the way that people make progress. And I think maybe it does make sense for utilitarians to get with other utilitarians, but then when they are having discussions with at conferences and so on, they ought to make sure that there are people there who are not holding their own, holding the same position as them. So philosophers ought to be much readier than they are to consider the views of their opponents.
Okay, very interesting. This seems to be a common problem in general, because these ideas are talked about frequently in social media circles and whatnot, to have access to people who disagree with you more. But very interesting ideas. I want to be very respectful of your time, Professor, and ask you a couple of final questions. One is, what do you think about the future of philosophy? Where do you see it going from here? And two is, what would you recommend? Which of your books or publications would you recommend, or are you most proud of for readers to look into?
Thanks. Well, who knows where philosophy will go? Who knows where anything will go? What I hope is that philosophy will continue, but become more like the kind of philosophy I was suggesting, a less dogmatic and less individualistic enterprise, in which people really are concerned to discover the truth rather than to persuade everybody that they've got the truth. That's what really matters. And I hope that we may make progress and converge on the truth in more areas than we have so far. I think philosophy has made some progress and we have made some discoveries, but it's very hard work, partly because of all the distortions that arise from our situation, but also because the questions are extremely difficult. So that would be my hope. It's not a prediction. It could well be that we will just go around in circles for a very long time.
Good point. And along these lines, can you recommend which of your books is your favorite, you're most proud of?
That's a good question. I mean, Reasons and the Good is really the only book in which I state my own view. So, and it's not very long, and I hope it's fairly clear. So I hope that some people might enjoy reading that. If they do, and they haven't read Sidgwick, then that is the book that I would recommend that anybody interested in moral philosophy should read.
Yeah, I second that recommendation. It's a great book, very clear, Very nice book. Professor, I want to thank you for your time today. I sincerely appreciate it and wish you the best in all of your endeavors.
Thanks very much, Louis. It's been a great pleasure.